Many years ago, I became fascinated with the idea that you could integrate the outcome of the planet, the desire to serve people and the planet, into investing. And people kept saying to me, but if you try to pick stocks based on those kinds of issues, you won't do as well. You'll be a poor investor. The answer seemed to be, let's measure the investment outcome of applying certain social and ethical criteria to an investment process. When we created what was at that time called the Domini 400 Social Index, we started by measuring companies in the United States. Since then, there have been indexes developed for the whole world. Each of these indexes has indicated that there is not a financial give-up when you take the kind of criteria that we take into account. Now, I am not surprised. We avoid problems. Usually, if you avoid problems in investing, you've given yourself an enhancement. But until Wall Street and the city in London could see actual statistical information that these kinds of criteria did not hurt and might help the investment process, we could not break through a barrier that existed. Everybody knew it would cost money. That was a big barrier. One of the motivations I had for creating an index of our own was to help to define the criteria that would be used. People would say to me, well, whose ethics are at work here? I don't think it's very difficult to describe a situation where there is harm to people or harm to the planet, and to try to mitigate that harm by avoiding investing in it. I'll give you an example: tobacco. Tobacco is a product that kills when it is used as intended. We don't buy tobacco. Another example, when companies began to purchase t-shirts or items from other companies, this was called supplier standards. You didn't know if there were child labor practices in those suppliers. And we began to ask the questions: how are you able to make such low-cost items for sale to American consumers? As the answers came back, now, today, 15 years later, we can begin to differentiate one company from another as regards its practices in sourcing materials. And since we now have that information, we now use that information in helping to inform what companies we will purchase. Now, there are two ideas at work here. One is the informing idea, and one is the we will not buy it idea. So we inform our decisions based on a good range of input that have to do with the stakeholders: the customers, the suppliers, the employees, the natural environment, the investors, and we have certain kinds of practices that are too much for us. And we'll generally see those in the case where there's a failure across those kinds of stakeholders. The customer's poorly suited, the investor's poorly suited, the environment is poorly treated, and then would avoid the company altogether. One of the terrific things that's happened in my field in the last 10 years has been that governments and stock exchanges around the world have mandated transparency and disclosure, and they've put in place a series of tools that people who are looking at companies can use. So for instance, in the United States, under the Dodd-Frank law, we just mandated that companies that extract minerals from other countries must report whether they pay those other countries a royalty for that extraction. The concept being here that we may be financing people who are in turn financing terrorism. And so we want to assure ourselves that when we're doing business in a nation that's unstable and has a a high degree of terrorist activity, that we're not actually financing an attack on our own shores. But that research is very helpful to me in understanding how entrenched a mining company is with these nations where there are no environmental laws or very poorly used protections for their workforce, and helps me see something else. You have in Brazil, in South Africa, in Indonesia, standards where you cannot even be on the stock exchanges there unless you disclose a full range of these kind of social and environmental criteria. Even in some countries where you would just think there would be a very laissez-faire attitude, like China. China has now mandated that if you are owned in part by China, by the nation, that you must file a social responsibility report. Now the next step is having these reports be comparable one to another. Now last year over 6,000 reports internationally were filed. So I mean, it's a miracle. There were none when I started in this work. So it's extraordinary to have these reports, and it's wonderful new information for us, but it's not very comparable yet one to another. So we would, as a next stage, start pushing greater comparison. Now, in smaller sense, there is some comparison. Let's say in Japan. Japan mandates that Japanese companies disclose their environmental cost to the society, the citizens of Japan. So they put figures into their annual report that talk about how much they did not pollute, how much they saved in their wastewater reduction and put monetary value on those savings. So I can compare Japanese companies very easily one to another. Wouldn't it be terrific if I had that tool for European and American companies? And I hope that's the direction that this field will take going forward.